The sun hung low over the rolling hills of Nebraska, casting long shadows across a patchwork of farmland below. Rebecca Hayes sat alone in the cockpit of her weathered single-prop aircraft, watching the amber light dance across her worn instrument panel. The small plane groaned softly with each shift in altitude, its faded blue paint telling stories of countless flights across forgotten skies. At 34, Rebecca had learned that being underestimated was often an advantage. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her green flight jacket faded at the cuffs from years of use. No insignia adorned her shoulders, no flight school patches decorated her sleeves. That was intentional. In her line of work, invisibility was survival. The radio crackled to life, breaking the peaceful hum of the engine. Sierra Lima 92, this is approach control. Please confirm your heading and altitude. Rebecca pressed the transmit button, her voice steady and professional. Approach control, Sierra Lima 92, heading 270, altitude 4,500 feet. Request permission to continue on current course. A pause. Then, Sierra Lima 92, we show no flight plan on file for your aircraft. Please state your destination and purpose. Rebecca's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She reached down and checked the folded paper map tucked beside her seat, its edges soft from handling. A small photograph was taped to her console, a young girl with pigtails grinning at the camera, maybe 6 years old. The child's eyes sparkled with the same quiet determination that now filled Rebecca's. Approach control. I'm conducting a routine training flight, VFR conditions, staying clear of controlled airspace. Wasn't entirely a lie. Training was exactly what this was, just not the kind they'd understand. Copy that, Sierra Lima 92. Maintain current altitude and heading. Contact departure control on 121.9. Rebecca switched frequencies, but something felt wrong. The back of her neck prickled with the sensation of being watched. 20 minutes later, her transponder began flashing an error code. She tapped the instrument with her knuckle, but the signal remained dark. What she didn't know was that 200 miles away, in a secure radar facility buried beneath Peterson Air Force Base, her aircraft had just appeared as an unidentified blip crossing into restricted airspace. "We've got a problem," muttered Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, leaning forward at his console. The green dot on his screen was moving steadily through a corridor that should have been empty. Unknown aircraft, no transponder, not responding to identification requests. His supervisor, Captain Derek Travis, moved behind him with coffee in hand. Travis was the kind of man who enjoyed his authority a little too much, the type who had never quite made it as far as he'd hoped and took his frustrations out on those beneath him. "Probably some weekend warrior who got lost," Travis said dismissively. "Send up a couple of birds to take a look." But as Marcus watched the blip continue its steady course, something nagged at him. The flight path was too precise, too purposeful, for a lost pilot. This wasn't someone bumbling around in the sky. This was someone who knew exactly where they were going. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "the flight pattern suggests advanced navigation skills." "Maybe we should just scramble the intercept," Travis cut him off. "If it's nothing, we'll have her back on the ground in an hour. If it's something, well, better safe than sorry." The order went out within minutes. 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons screamed off the runway at Buckley Air Force Base, their afterburners painting the sky with twin trails of fire. Major Jake Morrison and Captain Lisa Rodriguez were seasoned pilots, accustomed to routine intercepts of wayward aircraft. But as they climbed toward their target, neither expected to find anything more than a confused civilian who'd wandered into the wrong airspace. Rebecca saw them coming long before they announced themselves, 2 silver dots on the horizon, growing larger by the second. Her heart didn't race. Years of training had taught her to remain calm under pressure. Instead, she reached for her radio and waited. Unidentified aircraft, this is Viper 1-1. You are in restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately and follow our instructions. Rebecca keyed her mic. Viper 1-1, this is civilian aircraft Sierra Lima 92. I copy your transmission. There was a pause, then a different voice, cocky, amused. Well, at least she can talk. Thought we were chasing a ghost. Roger that, Viper 1-2, came Morrison's reply. Looks like Grandma's out for a Sunday drive in Grandpa's old crop duster. The jets flanked her now, close enough that she could see the pilots' helmets. Rebecca kept her hands steady on the controls, her breathing measured. She'd been mocked before. It came with the territory. Sierra Lima 92, you are ordered to descend immediately and follow us to the nearest airfield for questioning. Any deviation from our flight path will be considered hostile. Viper 1-1, I understand. Beginning descent now. As Rebecca pushed the nose of her aircraft down, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. In the distance, barely visible against the afternoon sky, another aircraft was climbing rapidly toward the western horizon. It was sleek, fast, and definitely not supposed to be there. The real target was getting away while they played games with her. But Rebecca said nothing. She followed the F-16s down toward the concrete runway of Peterson Air Force Base, where a crowd of personnel had already gathered to witness the capture of the mysterious pilot. Some held phones, others whispered, behind cupped hands. A few were already composing social media posts about the Air Force's latest catch. As her wheels touched down on the tarmac, Rebecca Hayes allowed herself one final glance at the photograph on her console. The little girl's smile seemed to whisper a promise. Soon, sweetheart. Soon. The real mission was just beginning. The moment Rebecca's aircraft rolled to a stop, Peterson Air Force Base transformed into a circus. Ground crews emerged from hangars with cell phones already recording. Security personnel jogged toward the plane with exaggerated urgency, their hands resting on their sidearms as if she might suddenly sprout weapons. Captain Travis had positioned himself at the observation deck overlooking the tarmac, surrounded by junior officers eager to witness what he'd already dubbed the catch of the day. His voice carried clearly through the control tower's open windows as he provided running commentary. "Look at that piece of junk," Travis said, gesturing at Rebecca's weathered aircraft. "Things held together with duct tape and prayer. Probably hasn't seen maintenance since the Carter administration." The laughter from his audience was immediate and cruel. Someone pulled out their phone to live stream the event, and within minutes, the footage was being shared across private military social media groups with captions like, "Breaking, Air Force captures dangerous senior citizen and world's most boring terrorist attack, foiled." Rebecca remained in her cockpit for a moment, her hands resting calmly on the yoke. Through her windscreen, she could see the approaching security team, their faces a mixture of amusement and annoyance. She unbuckled her harness with deliberate care, removed her headset, and opened the cockpit door. "Pilot, exit the aircraft with your hands visible." The command came through a bullhorn, though she was less than 20 feet away. "Do not reach for anything," Rebecca complied without hesitation, climbing down from the wing with her hands raised. Her boots hit the tarmac with a soft thud, and she stood perfectly still as the officers surrounded her. She was average height, unremarkable in appearance, exactly the kind of person who could disappear in a crowd. Well, said Lieutenant Frank Morrison, Jake's younger brother, who worked ground security. "What do we have here? Ma'am, do you have any idea what kind of airspace you just violated?" "I do," Rebecca replied quietly. "You do?" Frank's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Then maybe you can explain why you thought it was a good idea to take your flying lawnmower through a restricted military zone." More laughter rippled through the gathered crowd. Someone shouted, "Did she get lost on the way to the grocery store?" Another voice added, "Check her purse for knitting needles." Rebecca said nothing. Her expression remained neutral as they zip-tied her hands behind her back and patted her down. Her flight bag was dumped unceremoniously onto the concrete, its contents scattered for all to see: hand-drawn navigation charts, a worn logbook, energy bars, and a thermos of coffee. Technical Sergeant Amy Rodriguez, no relation to the F-16 pilot, knelt beside the scattered items, holding up the logbook like it was evidence in a major crime. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced in a theatrical voice, "we've uncovered the mastermind's sophisticated flight planning system. Pencil on paper." Revolutionary. The crowd ate it up. Camera flashes popped as Rebecca was guided toward a waiting security van, her torn flight jacket damaged when an overzealous guard had yanked her arm too hard during the search, fluttered in the afternoon breeze. But not everyone was laughing. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole stood apart from the crowd, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Something about this whole situation bothered him. The woman's flight path had been too precise, her responses too calm. Most civilians in this situation would be crying, protesting, demanding lawyers. This pilot acted like she'd been expecting this to happen. "Hey, Marcus!" Travis called out from the observation deck. "What's with the long face? We just netted ourselves a real live sky criminal." Marcus forced a smile and waved, but his unease only deepened. He'd been tracking aircraft for 8 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. Everything about this felt wrong. As the security van pulled away with Rebecca in the back, the crowd began to disperse. The live streams ended, the phones were pocketed, and the laughter faded. Within an hour, the only evidence of the incident was some scattered paperwork blowing across the tarmac and a growing collection of social media posts mocking the Grandma pilot. But in a secure communications room on the other side of the base, a different conversation was taking place. "Sir, we intercepted an unidentified aircraft at 14:30 hours, reported Major Morrison to his commanding officer over a secure line. "Pilot is in custody. Appears to be a civilian who got lost." "Civilian?" The voice on the other end was sharp, concerned. "Are you certain?" "Yes, sir. Middle-aged woman flying an old Cessna. No military markings, no sophisticated equipment. Probably just a weekend pilot who made a wrong turn." There was a long pause. "Major, I need you to double-check something. Run the aircraft registration through all databases, not just civilian. Check military, federal, and classified registries. Sir, that seems like overkill for—" "Just do it, Major, and do it now." As Morrison hung up the phone, he felt the first flutter of doubt. Why would his CO be so concerned about a simple airspace violation? And why did he suddenly have the feeling that they'd just made a very serious mistake? Back in the holding cell, Rebecca Hayes sat on a narrow bench, her hands folded in her lap. The zip ties had been replaced with standard handcuffs, though she'd made no attempt to resist or escape. She stared at the concrete wall in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. Somewhere out there, the real target was still flying free. The mission she'd spent months preparing for had been derailed by a bureaucratic mix-up and a group of people who saw only what they expected to see: a harmless woman in an old airplane. But Rebecca had been underestimated before. It was, she'd learned long ago, one of her greatest strengths. She closed her eyes and began to count. In her experience, it usually took about 6 hours for the truth to surface. She'd give them 4 before she started to worry. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward, and Rebecca Hayes waited for the world to catch up with what she already knew. 4 hours later, Rebecca remained in the holding cell, but the atmosphere at Peterson Air Force Base had shifted dramatically. The laughter from the afternoon had been replaced by hushed conversations and nervous glances. Major Morrison found himself pacing the communications room, staring at a computer screen that had just delivered the most unsettling message of his military career. Aircraft registration. Sierra Lima. 92, classified, access denied, contact central. Clearance immediately, authorization level, eyes only. What the hell does that mean? Morrison muttered, reaching for his secure phone. Meanwhile, in the security office, Captain Travis was conducting what he believed to be a routine interrogation. Rebecca sat across from him at a metal table, her hand still cuffed, her expression unchanged from the moment she'd landed. "So, Rebecca," Travis said, reading from her confiscated driver's license, "want to tell me what you were really doing up there? Survey work? Smuggling? Or are you just one of those thrill seekers who gets off on breaking federal law?" Rebecca looked at him steadily. "I was conducting a training flight." "Training for what? Crop dusting? Stunt flying?" Travis's voice dripped with condescension. "Lady, that airplane of yours is older than my marriage. What kind of training requires flying through restricted military airspace, the kind you don't have clearance to know about?" Travis laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Oh, that's rich. You think you're some kind of secret agent? Let me tell you something, sweetheart. I've been in the Air Force for 15 years. I've seen real military pilots, real classified operations. You're not it." Rebecca said nothing, but something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of steel that Travis was too arrogant to recognize. "You know what I think?" Travis continued, leaning back in his chair. "I think you're just another deluded civilian who watches too many spy movies. Maybe you've got some fantasy about being important, being special. But reality check. You're nobody. You fly a garbage plane, you have no credentials, and you just committed a federal crime because you wanted to feel like Tom Cruise for an afternoon." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't even blink. She simply stared at Travis with the patience of someone who had endured far worse than his petty cruelty. But her silence only fueled his anger. "You know what's going to happen now?" Travis stood up, beginning to pace around her chair. "You're going to be charged with violating restricted airspace, reckless endangerment, and probably terrorism-related offenses. Once we dig deeper into your background, you'll lose your pilot's license, assuming you actually have one, and you'll spend the next few years in federal prison explaining to your cellmates how you ended up there by playing pretend pilot." He leaned down close to her ear. "And that little girl in the photo we found in your plane? The one you keep looking at like she's your whole world? She's going to grow up knowing her grandmother is a convicted felon who was too stupid to stay out of military airspace." For the first time since her arrest, Rebecca's composure cracked. Her jaw tightened, her hands clenched into fists, and when she looked up at Travis, her eyes held something that made him take an involuntary step backward. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. "I know enough," Travis shot back, trying to regain his bravado. "I know you're nobody special, flying nowhere important, pretending to be something you're not." "Then why?" Rebecca asked, her voice still quiet, but carrying an edge like a blade. "Are you so afraid to make that phone call?" Travis froze. "What phone call?" "The one to verify my credentials. The one your commanding officer ordered 2 hours ago. The one you've been avoiding because deep down, you know something doesn't add up." How did she know about that? Travis felt sweat beading on his forehead. The order had come down through official channels. Verify the pilot's credentials through all available databases. But Travis had been too busy enjoying his moment of superiority to actually follow through. Before he could respond, the door burst open. Major Morrison entered with two other officers, their faces grim. Behind them walked a man in a dark suit, someone Travis had never seen before, but who radiated the kind of authority that made career military officers stand straighter. "Captain Travis," Morrison said formally, "you're relieved of this interrogation immediately. Return to your quarters and await further orders." "Sir, I don't understand." "You don't need to understand," the man in the suit said quietly. His voice carried the weight of unquestionable authority. "You need to leave now." As Travis was escorted out, protesting and confused, the man in the suit approached Rebecca's chair. Without ceremony, he produced a small key and unlocked her handcuffs. "Commander Hayes," he said formally, "I apologize for this misunderstanding. Your mission parameters have been classified at the highest levels for operational security. The personnel here were not briefed on your activities." Rebecca rubbed her wrists where the cuffs had chafed. "Status of the primary target? Still airborne. But there's a window if you can lift off within the hour." For the first time since her arrest, Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't pleasant. "My aircraft, refueled and ready. Your equipment has been secured and returned to the cockpit." Rebecca stood, her movements fluid despite hours of confinement. As she walked toward the door, she paused beside Major Morrison, who was staring at her with the expression of a man whose worldview had just been thoroughly shattered. "Major," she said quietly, "the next time someone tells you they're conducting training, you might want to ask what they're training for." She walked out of the interrogation room and into the corridor where Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole was waiting. He'd been the one to finally make the call that changed everything, the one whose instincts had refused to let him dismiss her as harmless. "Ma'am," he said, snapping to attention. Rebecca paused, studying his face. "You knew, didn't you? Even when everyone else was laughing, you knew something was wrong." Marcus nodded slowly. "Your flight path was too precise. Your responses too controlled. I've seen lost pilots before. They panic. They make mistakes. You did everything perfectly, even under pressure. Good instincts, Sergeant. Don't let anyone talk you out of trusting them." As Rebecca walked toward the exit, she could hear the murmur of voices behind her, people trying to process what had just happened, how badly they'd misjudged the situation. Captain Travis was arguing with someone in a distant office, his voice high and desperate. But Rebecca wasn't thinking about any of them. She was thinking about a sleek aircraft racing across the western sky, carrying something that could threaten thousands of lives. She was thinking about a little girl with pigtails who was counting on her grandmother to keep the world safe. And she was thinking about how satisfying it was going to be to prove that being underestimated was the most dangerous mistake her enemies could make. The real hunt was about to begin. The walk to the flight line felt like a parade of shame for everyone except Rebecca. Word had spread quickly through the base about the mix-up, and personnel lined the corridors to catch a glimpse of the woman who had just turned their world upside down. Some stared in confusion, others in embarrassment, but all with a newfound wariness. Rebecca moved through the gauntlet with the same calm precision she'd maintained throughout her arrest. Her flight suit had been cleaned and pressed, her equipment returned, but the small bandage around her left wrist, where the cuffs had cut into her skin, remained as a quiet reminder of the last few hours. The man in the dark suit, who had introduced himself only as Agent Walsh, walked beside her, speaking in low tones about mission parameters and time windows, but Rebecca's attention was focused elsewhere. Through the windows, she could see her aircraft on the tarmac, surrounded by ground crew who were checking and rechecking every system. The target aircraft was tracked heading northwest at approximately 1800 hours, Walsh continued. Long-range surveillance suggests it's maintaining a course toward the Canadian border. If it crosses international airspace, it won't, Rebecca said simply. Walsh looked at her with surprise. Commander, I appreciate your confidence, but we're looking at a sophisticated operation here. This isn't some amateur smuggling run. The aircraft we're tracking has military-grade stealth capabilities, advanced countermeasures. I know what we're tracking. Rebecca's voice carried a certainty that made Walsh stop walking. I've been hunting this particular ghost for 8 months. Today was supposed to be the day we finally brought it down. They reached the aircraft, and Rebecca began her pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency. Every control surface, every instrument, every connection was verified with the methodical care of someone whose life depended on mechanical perfection. Staff Sergeant Cole approached hesitantly, carrying a manila folder. Ma'am, I thought you should know. I pulled the radar tracking data from this afternoon. The signature that triggered our intercept protocols wasn't random. Someone deliberately spoofed your transponder code. Rebecca looked up from checking her aileron. Cables, show me. Marcus opened the folder, revealing printouts of radar tracks and communication logs. Here, at 13:47 hours, your transponder briefly transmitted a restricted military frequency, but the signal originated from a location approximately 50 miles north of your actual position. A decoy, Rebecca murmured, studying the data. Though they used my call sign to draw the intercept away from their actual flight path. That's what I'm thinking. Whoever we're really after knew about your mission, knew you'd be in the area, and used you as bait to clear their escape route. Walsh frowned. That suggests a security leak at the highest levels. Rebecca handed the folder back to Marcus, but not before noting something that made her pause. The spoofed signal had been transmitted on a frequency that required intimate knowledge of classified military protocols. This wasn't just any smuggling operation. It was being run by someone with deep access to Air Force communications systems. Sergeant, she said quietly, I want you to run a check on everyone who had access to today's flight schedules, not just the people in your unit, everyone. Base commanders, security personnel, maintenance crews. Someone on this base knew I was coming. Marcus nodded grimly. I'll have the list within the hour. As Rebecca completed her pre-flight check, her mind was already working through the tactical implications. If there was a mole on the base, then her mission had been compromised from the beginning. The target she was hunting, a stolen military prototype carrying classified bioweapons technology, had been given a significant head start thanks to the afternoon's misunderstanding. But Rebecca had been in worse situations. She'd spent 3 years in Afghanistan tracking insurgent supply routes through terrain that made Nebraska look like a city park. She'd infiltrated arms dealers in Eastern Europe, working undercover for months while her family believed she was dead. Being underestimated by a handful of American airmen was hardly her greatest challenge. Agent Walsh cleared his throat. Commander, given the security concerns, perhaps we should consider aborting this mission. We could coordinate with Canadian authorities, set up a border intercept. No. Rebecca's tone brooked no argument. Every hour that aircraft remains airborne increases the risk of the technology falling into hostile hands. We end this tonight. She climbed into her cockpit and began the startup sequence. The familiar hum of instruments coming online was like a meditation, centering her thoughts and focusing her resolve. Through her headset, she could hear air traffic control coordinating her departure, their voices noticeably more respectful than they had been that afternoon. Sierra Lima 92, you are cleared for immediate departure. Any direction, any altitude. All civilian traffic has been diverted from your flight path. Roger, control. Sierra Lima 92 departing runway 27 heading northwest. As her aircraft lifted off into the darkening sky, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The people who had mocked her, dismissed her, and treated her like a harmless old woman were now watching her disappear into the distance with a mixture of awe and shame. But the real satisfaction would come later, when she finally caught up with the aircraft that had been eluding her for months. The pilot of that stolen prototype thought he was clever, using her as a distraction to escape military detection. What he didn't realize was that Rebecca Hayes had been hunting ghosts long before he'd learned to fly. Her aircraft climbed steadily into the night sky, its old engine running smooth and strong. On her console, the photograph of her granddaughter seemed to smile encouragement in the dim glow of the instrument lights. "Almost there, sweetheart," Rebecca whispered. "Grandma's got one more mission to finish." Behind her, Peterson Air Force Base grew smaller in the darkness. Ahead of her, somewhere in the vast expanse of American airspace, a thief was about to learn that the woman he'd used as a pawn was actually the Queen. The hunt was back on. 3 hours into the night flight, Rebecca's patience was rewarded. Her aircraft's modified radar, disguised to look like standard civilian equipment, picked up a faint signature moving low along the Wyoming-Montana border. The target was good, she had to admit, flying barely above ground level using terrain, masking to avoid military radar sites, maintaining radio silence. But Rebecca had advantages her prey didn't know about. Control, Sierra Lima 92, requesting permission to descend to 2,000 feet for weather avoidance. Sierra Lima 92, cleared to descend. Be advised of mountain wave activity in your area. Rebecca's lips curved in a slight smile. There was no weather to avoid and no mountain wave activity. But the air traffic controller, now briefed on the classified nature of her mission, was providing perfect cover for her tactical maneuvers. As she descended, her aircraft's passive sensors locked on to the target. The stolen prototype was running. Dark, no navigation lights, no transponder, no radio transmissions. It was a sleek, angular aircraft that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie rather than the skies over Montana. Millions of dollars in taxpayer money, years of development, and enough classified technology to shift the balance of power in the wrong hands. The pilot was good, but he had one weakness: arrogance. He believed he'd outsmarted the entire US military by using Rebecca as an unwitting decoy. What he didn't realize was that Rebecca had been tracking him long before today's accidental intercept. She reached for her radio, but not the civilian frequency she'd been using. Hidden beneath her instrument panel was a secure military communication system, encrypted and undetectable to standard receivers. Overwatch, this is Whisper.
I have eyes on the package. The response came immediately. Whisper, this is Overwatch.
Confirm visual contact with target. Confirmed. Target is proceeding northwest at approximately 150 knots, altitude 500 feet, AGL. Appears to be following the Yellowstone River Valley. Copy. Whisper. Canadian authorities have been notified and are standing by. Your orders are to shadow and report. Do not engage unless the target attempts to cross international boundaries. Rebecca frowned. Shadow and report? After 8 months of hunting, after being humiliated and mocked at Peterson, after having her cover blown by amateurs, they wanted her to just watch? Overwatch. Be advised the target has already demonstrated knowledge of classified flight schedules and access to restricted military frequencies. Likelihood of additional security breaches is high. Understood, Whisper. Maintain surveillance and await further orders. Rebecca switched off the secure radio and continued tracking her target. But she wasn't planning to just watch anymore. The people in the secure bunkers and conference rooms could issue all the cautious orders they wanted. She was the one in the sky, the one who had sacrificed her cover to get this close. The stolen aircraft began to climb, heading toward a mountain. Past that would take it over the Continental Divide. Once it crossed that ridge, it would have a clear path to the Canadian border and international waters beyond. Rebecca calculated distances, fuel consumption, and flight times. She had maybe 30 minutes before the window closed forever. That's when she noticed something that changed everything. The target aircraft wasn't alone. Her radar showed a second signature, smaller and maintaining formation with the prototype. As Rebecca watched, the two aircraft separated briefly, and she caught a glimpse of something being transferred between them. A small package dropped from one plane to the other. The bioweapons technology wasn't on the prototype. It was on the second aircraft, which was now turning back toward American airspace while the prototype continued toward Canada. The entire escape plan was a shell game, with the real prize heading back into the heartland where it could disappear forever. Rebecca made a decision that would have consequences far beyond her mission. She banked hard to the left, abandoning her pursuit of the prototype to follow the smaller aircraft. As she did, she activated every emergency beacon on her plane, broadcasting a priority alert on all military frequencies. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Commander Rebecca Hayes, call sign Whisper. I have identified a critical national security threat proceeding southbound from the Montana-Wyoming border. Request immediate intercept by all available aircraft. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Air Force bases across 3 states scrambled fighter jets, National Guard units activated emergency protocols, and civilian air traffic was immediately grounded across a 1,000-square-mile area. But Rebecca wasn't waiting for backup. The small aircraft ahead of her was fast, but her old Cessna had been modified in ways that weren't immediately apparent. She pushed her throttles forward, and hidden turbochargers spun to life, doubling her engine's power output. Her airspeed climbed rapidly as she closed the distance to her target. The pilot of the smaller aircraft finally noticed he was being pursued. Rebecca watched him bank sharply to the east, heading for the maze of canyons and valleys that could provide concealment. But she'd been flying over this terrain for months, studying every ridge and ravine, preparing for exactly this moment. Unknown aircraft, this is U.S. Air Force Commander Hayes. You are ordered to land immediately at the nearest suitable airfield. Any attempt to flee will be considered an act of terrorism. The response came in heavily accented English. American pilot, you are mistaken. I am conducting legitimate scientific research under international aviation protocols. Rebecca almost laughed. Even now, with fighter jets converging from every direction, the man was trying to bluff his way out. Scientific research doesn't usually involve stolen military prototypes and classified bioweapons technology. The silence that followed told Rebecca everything she needed to know. The pilot had just realized that his carefully planned operation had been compromised from the beginning. What he thought was a lucky break, using Rebecca as a distraction, had actually led him directly into the trap she'd been setting for months. Behind her, she could see the contrails of approaching F-16s, their afterburners painting streaks of fire across the night sky. But Rebecca didn't need their help anymore. She had the target cornered, outmaneuvered, and running out of options. The real satisfaction wasn't in the chase. It was in the knowledge that everyone who had underestimated her was about to witness exactly what Commander Rebecca Whisper Hayes was capable of when she finally decided to stop being quiet. Babishitsa, canyon walls rose like cathedral spires around Rebecca's aircraft as she pursued the fleeing smuggler through the narrow valley. Her target was flying dangerously low, weaving between rock formations in a desperate attempt to break her lock. But Rebecca had chosen this battleground deliberately. She knew every wind pattern, every thermal updraft, every trick the terrain could offer. "Whisper, this is Viper Lead. We have you on radar. ETA to your position is 8 minutes. Rebecca keyed her mic while maintaining visual contact with the target aircraft. "Viper Lead, be advised the target is carrying Level 4 biological materials. If that aircraft crashes in populated area, we're looking at a potential catastrophe. Copy that." Whisper, "What's your plan?" Rebecca's plan was simple, dangerous, and completely against protocol. She was going to force the smuggler to land on her terms, in a location where the stolen technology could be recovered safely. The abandoned airstrip at Copper Ridge was only 5 miles ahead, a remote World War II training facility that had been closed for decades but whose runway was still intact. "Target aircraft, this is your final warning. You have 30 seconds to turn toward Copper Ridge Airfield, or I will be forced to disable your aircraft." The smuggler's response was to dive even lower, his wingtips nearly brushing the canyon walls. He was gambling that Rebecca wouldn't risk a confrontation in such tight quarters, betting that her concern for civilian safety would force her to back off. He was wrong. Rebecca had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan flying combat missions through mountain passes that made this canyon look like a highway. She pulled her aircraft into a steep climb, gaining altitude and positioning herself directly above her target. Then, with the precision that had made her a legend among those who knew her real job, she began to execute a maneuver that officially didn't exist. Her Cessna carried more than just turbochargers and enhanced radar. Hidden in her wing roots were small devices that could generate powerful electromagnetic pulses, not enough to permanently damage an aircraft, but sufficient to temporarily disable its electronics. The technology was experimental, classified, and absolutely not authorized for use over American territory. Rebecca didn't care about authorization anymore. "Forgive me, Control," she whispered into her mic as she armed the EMP system. "Sometimes you have to break the rules to save lives." The pulse discharge was invisible, but its effects were immediate. The target aircraft's engines sputtered as its electronic ignition system failed. Navigation instruments went dark, communications, equipment died, and the pilot found himself flying a machine that had suddenly reverted to the mechanical age. But the smuggler was better than Rebecca had anticipated. Instead of panicking, he managed to restart his engines using manual procedures, compensating for the loss of electronic systems with pure flying skill. For a moment, Rebecca felt a grudging respect for her adversary. That respect ended when he opened fire. The muzzle flashes from the target aircraft lit up the canyon like deadly fireflies. Rebecca threw her plane into an aggressive, evasive pattern, feeling bullets punch through her starboard wing. Her fuel tank took a hit, and aviation gas began streaming behind her in a silver trail. "Whisper, we're showing fuel loss on your aircraft." Viper Lead's voice crackled through her headset. "Break off engagement and return to base immediately." "Negative, Viper Lead. Target is armed and extremely dangerous. I'm ending this now." Rebecca had one advantage her attacker didn't know about. The photograph taped to her console wasn't just a picture of her granddaughter. It was covering a hidden switch that activated her aircraft's final modification. Beneath the worn exterior of her Cessna lay the heart of a combat aircraft, complete with hardened systems and defensive countermeasures. She flipped the switch, and suddenly her damaged aircraft transformed. Armor plating slid up to protect. Vital systems, her engines switched to an internal oxygen supply to prevent fuel-air explosions, and targeting systems came online with military precision. The smuggler realized too late that he'd been hunting the wrong prey. As he banked hard to the right, trying to escape the canyon, Rebecca positioned herself perfectly for the shot she'd been planning for 8 months. Instead of weapons, her aircraft deployed a high-tech net launcher designed to disable aircraft without destroying them or their precious cargo. The carbon fiber mesh deployed perfectly, wrapping around the target's propeller and control surfaces. The Smuggler's aircraft lurched violently as its controls locked up. With no choice but to land, he aimed for the abandoned Copper Ridge airstrip, Rebecca following close behind as he made a rough but survivable landing on the cracked concrete runway. As both aircraft rolled to a stop in the Montana wilderness, the sound of approaching F-16s filled the air. But Rebecca was already out of her cockpit, moving toward the downed aircraft with the fluid precision of someone who had done this many times before. The Smuggler emerged from his plane with his hands raised, his face showing a mixture of defeat and grudging admiration. He was younger than Rebecca had expected, maybe 35, with the lean build and alert eyes of a professional pilot. "Commander Hayes," he said in accented English, "your reputation doesn't do you justice. You know who I am. Anyone in our business knows about Whisper, the ghost pilot who appears from nowhere and vanishes without a trace. We thought you were retired." Rebecca smiled coldly. "I was, until you stole something that belongs to my granddaughter's future." She secured the stolen bioweapons technology while they waited for backup to arrive. The vials were exactly where intelligence had predicted, in a specially designed carrying case that would have protected them even in a crash. Technology that could have been used to create devastating biological weapons was now safely back in American hands. As the F-16s landed on the old runway, their pilots climbing out to secure the scene, Rebecca found herself surrounded by the same kind of military personnel who had mocked her just hours earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Major Morrison approached with visible embarrassment. "Commander Hayes, I want to apologize for this afternoon's misunderstanding." "No need, Major. You were doing your job." Sometimes the best cover is being underestimated. Captain Travis appeared last, escorted by military police. He'd been arrested an hour earlier when the security investigation revealed he'd been feeding information to foreign agents, including Rebecca's mission schedule. His face was pale as he realized the woman he'd humiliated was the same person who had just prevented a national security disaster. "You knew," he said to Rebecca as the MPs led him past. "You knew I was the leak," Rebecca nodded. "The moment you mentioned my granddaughter in the interrogation. That information wasn't in any file you should have had access to. It took someone with deep intelligence connections to know that detail." As Travis was loaded into a transport helicopter, Rebecca turned her attention back to her aircraft. The fuel leak had been stopped by emergency systems, but she'd need extensive repairs before flying again. "Commander," Agent Walsh approached with a secure communication device. "Washington wants to debrief you immediately." Rebecca shook her head. "Washington can wait. I have a promise to keep." She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. When a small voice answered, Rebecca's stern expression melted into a grandmother's smile. "Hi, sweetheart. It's Grandma. I'm sorry.
I missed your soccer game today, but I had some work to finish. How about I take you flying this weekend? I've got some new stories to tell you."
As Rebecca talked to her granddaughter while standing beside 2 disabled aircraft in an abandoned airfield surrounded by F-16s and Special Forces operators, Major Morrison finally understood what he'd witnessed that afternoon. It wasn't the arrest of a confused civilian. It was the deliberate sacrifice of a Legends cover to protect something more important than any single mission. The woman they'd called Grandma Pilot was actually one of the most dangerous people in American skies, and she'd been hiding in plain sight all along. 2 weeks later, Rebecca Hayes sat in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon, facing a panel of senior military officials and intelligence directors. Her written report lay on the table before them, 47 pages detailing the 8-month operation that had culminated in the recovery of stolen bioweapons technology and the exposure of a spy ring that reached into the highest levels of the Air Force. General Patricia Morrison, no relation to the Major, led the debriefing. She was a stern woman in her 50s who had risen through the ranks during an era when female combat pilots were still breaking barriers. She understood better than most what Rebecca had accomplished. "Commander Hayes," the general began, "your mission was classified as a complete success. The stolen technology has been secured, the foreign agent has been neutralized, and the domestic spy ring has been dismantled. However, there are concerns about your methods." Rebecca sat quietly, her hands folded on the table. She wore a simple business suit rather than a uniform, looking more like a suburban grandmother than a legendary covert operative. The bandage around her wrist had been removed, but faint marks from the handcuffs were still visible. "You violated direct orders by engaging the target," continued another panel member, a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his life in underground bunkers. "You deployed experimental weapons over populated areas. You compromised years of careful cover building by revealing your true identity to base personnel." "Yes, sir," Rebecca replied calmly. "I did all of those things. Your justification?" Rebecca looked around the table at the assembled officials, people who made life-and-death decisions from the safety of climate-controlled offices, who sent others into danger while they managed risk from a distance. "The mission parameters changed when I discovered the target had inside knowledge of our operations. Every minute of delay increased the risk of the technology disappearing permanently. I made a tactical decision based on field conditions." General Morrison leaned forward. "A decision that could have cost you your life. That fuel tank hit was inches from your engine. If you'd lost power over those mountains—" "But I didn't," Rebecca said simply. "And now a potential biological weapon is back in secure storage instead of being sold to the highest bidder." The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering every detail of the operation. Rebecca answered each question with the same measured precision she'd shown throughout the mission. She didn't apologize for her actions, didn't express regret for the risks taken, and didn't show any concern for the consequences she might face. Finally, General Morrison dismissed the other panel members, leaving herself alone with Rebecca. Off the record, the general said once the room was secure, "That was some of the finest operational flying I've ever seen. The way you used those F-16s as unwitting backup, the psychological profile you built on the target, the tactical innovation with the EMP system, textbook perfection. Thank you, Ma'am, but it's over, isn't it? 23 years of covert operations, and now your face is known to half the Air Force. Your cover is permanently blown." Rebecca nodded. "I've been thinking about retirement anyway. My granddaughter's getting older, and she needs her grandmother around more than the country needs another ghost pilot." General Morrison slid a folder across the table. "Your pension, paperwork, full benefits, classified service medal, and a letter of commendation that will remain sealed for the next 50 years. Officially, you were never here." Rebecca opened the folder but didn't look at the contents. "What about the people at Peterson, the ones who were involved in my arrest?" "Major Morrison has been transferred to a desk job pending investigation. Staffy Sergeant Cole received a commendation for his instincts and attention to detail. He's being fast-tracked for officer training. The others involved have been counseled about operational security, but no disciplinary action was taken. And Captain Travis?" General Morrison's expression hardened. "Captain Travis is facing court-martial for treason, conspiracy, and violation of the Espionage Act. The information he provided to foreign agents compromised 7 active operations and put dozens of lives at risk. He's looking at life in federal prison." Rebecca felt a grim satisfaction at that news. Travis had betrayed his oath, his country, and his fellow service members for money. Whatever happened to him in prison would be too good for him. "One last question," General Morrison said as Rebecca prepared to leave. "The way you handled that interrogation, letting them mock you and humiliate you, was that planned?" Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile she'd shown during the entire debriefing. "General, I've been underestimated my entire career. By the time I was 12, I learned that people see what they expect to see. Travis and his people saw an old woman in a beaten-up airplane, so that's what they treated me as. It never occurred to them to question why someone who looked harmless would be flying through restricted airspace. And if they had questioned it, then I would have found another way. There's always another way." Rebecca left the Pentagon that afternoon and drove home to her small house in suburban Virginia. Her granddaughter, Emma, was waiting on the front porch, soccer ball at her feet, grinning with the excitement of a 7-year-old who'd been promised a flying lesson. "Grandma, you're back. Can we go flying now? Can we really go flying?" Rebecca
knelt down and hugged Emma tightly, breathing in the scent of childhood innocence and possibility. For 8 months, she'd carried the weight of a mission that could have changed the course of history. Now, holding her granddaughter, she felt that weight finally lift. "Yes, sweetheart, we can go flying."
"But first, do you want to hear a story about a little airplane that fooled everyone into thinking it was just an ordinary plane?" Emma's eyes lit up with curiosity. Was it a true story? Rebecca looked up at the sky, where contrails from military aircraft crisscrossed the blue expanse like invisible highways carrying secrets and protectors to places the world would never know about. "All the best stories are true, Emma. Sometimes they just take a while to tell." As grandmother and granddaughter walked hand in hand toward the small aircraft parked in the field behind their house, neither of them noticed the black sedan that had been following Rebecca since she left the Pentagon. Inside, Agent Walsh spoke quietly into a secure phone. "She's clear. The mission is classified as closed. Whisper is officially retired." But Walsh couldn't shake the feeling that America hadn't seen the last of Commander Rebecca Hayes. People like her didn't really retire, they just found new missions to fly. And somewhere in the skies above them, the next generation of threats was already taking shape, waiting for the next time the country would need a ghost pilot who could hide in plain sight. 6 months after the Peterson Air Force Base incident, a young pilot named Lieutenant Jessica Chen found herself standing in the same briefing room where Rebecca Hayes had once been interrogated. Jessica was fresh out of flight school, eager to prove herself, and absolutely terrified of the assignment she'd just received. "Lieutenant," said Colonel Anderson, the new base commander who had replaced the officers cashiered in the security review, "you're being assigned to a very special program. Have you ever heard of Operation Whisper?" Jessica shook her head. "No, sir." "Good. That means the classification protocols are working." Anderson slid a thin folder across the table. "This program trains pilots in deep cover operations, missions where you'll be operating civilian aircraft in hostile environments, often without backup or official support." Jessica opened the folder and found herself looking at a photograph of an ordinary-looking woman standing beside a weathered Cessna. There was something about the woman's eyes, a depth of experience and quiet confidence that made Jessica straighten unconsciously. "Your instructor is a retired Air Force commander who ran similar operations for over 2 decades. She's agreed to train a select few pilots in her methods, but she has some unusual requirements." "Such as, sir?" "She insists on complete anonymity. You'll know her only as Ghost. She'll evaluate your flying skills, your judgment under pressure, and your ability to think tactically while maintaining civilian cover. Most importantly, she'll test whether you can be underestimated without becoming vulnerable. Anderson's expression grew serious. Lieutenant, this woman is a legend in intelligence circles. The mission she completed here 6 months ago prevented a biological weapons attack that could have killed thousands of people. She did it by allowing herself to be arrested, humiliated, and dismissed as harmless. That kind of psychological strength is rare. Jessica felt a flutter of excitement mixed with intimidation. When do I start? Tomorrow morning? So 600 hours at Hangar 7, and Lieutenant, don't expect her to be impressed by your credentials or your test scores. She'll want to know if you can handle being invisible. The next morning, Jessica arrived at Hangar 7 to find a small group of pilots already assembled. There were 6 of them total, 4 men and 2 women, all young, all looking as nervous as she felt. At the front of the hangar stood a woman in civilian clothes, her greying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice carrying easily through the hangar without seeming raised. "I'm your instructor. You can call
me Ghost. For the next 6 weeks, I'm going to teach you how to hide in plain sight." She gestured toward a row of civilian aircraft parked along the hangar wall.
They were all older models, Cessnas, Pipers, Beechcraft, the kind of planes you'd see at any small-town airport. "These aircraft have been modified," Ghost continued. "They look ordinary, but they carry advanced avionics, defensive systems, and capabilities that officially don't exist. Your job is to learn to fly them without anyone suspecting they're anything more than weekend hobby planes." One of the male pilots raised his hand. "Ma'am, what kind of missions would we be flying?" Ghost's smile was enigmatic. "The kind that don't appear in official records, the kind where success is measured by how many people never know you were there." The training was unlike anything Jessica had experienced in her military career. They practiced flying under civilian air traffic control, learned to communicate using coded language that sounded like ordinary pilot chatter, and rehearsed emergency procedures for situations that weren't covered in any manual. But the most challenging part wasn't the flying, it was the psychological training. "You need to understand," Ghost told them during one classroom session, "that your greatest weapon is other people's assumptions. If you look like a threat, you'll be treated as one. If you look harmless, you become invisible." She showed them video, footage from the Peterson incident, not the classified operational recordings, but the social media posts and news coverage that had followed. Jessica watched in fascination as uniformed personnel mocked and dismissed the woman who would later be revealed as one of the most successful covert pilots in American history. "Notice how they see what they expect to see," Ghost continued. "An older woman in an old airplane must be harmless. A quiet pilot who doesn't argue must be intimidated. These assumptions become their weakness and your strength." Over the weeks, Jessica began to understand the true nature of what they were learning. It wasn't just about flying, it was about becoming a different kind of warrior. One who fought not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through intelligence, patience, and the ability to be consistently underestimated. The final test came during the 6th week. Each pilot was given a mission. Infiltrate a mock terrorist cell, gather intelligence, and report back without compromising their cover. Jessica was assigned to pose as a flight instructor at a small civilian airport where suspected arms dealers were using private aircraft to transport weapons. For 3 days, she played the role of a cheerful, slightly scattered young pilot who was more interested in discussing weather patterns than asking probing questions. She let the suspects dismiss her as harmless, even enduring condescending comments about lady pilots who should stick to flying training aircraft. But while they laughed at her, Jessica was memorizing tail numbers, recording conversations, and mapping flight patterns. On the 4th day, she provided intelligence that led to the arrest of 12 suspects, and the seizure of enough illegal weapons to arm a small militia. When the exercise concluded, Ghost gathered the 6 pilots for their final debriefing. 5.
Of you passed this exercise, she announced. One of you failed. She looked directly at the pilot who had raised his hand on the first day, a cocky young man named Lieutenant Bradley, who had struggled with the concept of appearing vulnerable.
Lieutenant Bradley, you performed admirably in gathering intelligence and maintaining your cover. However, you couldn't resist showing off your flying skills during a routine training flight. Your target suspects became curious about why a civilian instructor was performing military precision aerobatics. That curiosity could have blown your cover and compromised the entire operation. Bradley's face reddened. "Ma'am, I was just demonstrating advanced techniques." "You were feeding your ego." Ghost cut him off. "In covert operations, ego kills. The moment you need people to know how skilled you are, you've stopped being invisible." She turned to address the remaining 5 pilots. "Congratulations, you've learned the first lesson of ghost operations. True strength comes from restraint, not display. You'll receive your operational assignments within the month." As the group dispersed, Jessica lingered behind. Something about Ghost's teaching style, her emphasis on psychological tactics, reminded her of the stories she'd heard about the Peterson incident.
"Ma'am," Jessica said carefully, "can I ask you something?" Ghost paused in packing her materials. "What is it?" "The pilot from the Peterson incident, the one they called Whisper. Do you know what happened to her?" Ghost was quiet for a long moment,
her hands still on the folder she was closing. When she looked up, there was something in her eyes that Jessica couldn't quite identify.
"I heard she retired," Ghost said finally. "Decided to spend more time with her family. Do you think she really retired? Or is she still out there somewhere?" Ghost's smile was mysterious. "Lieutenant, in this business, retirement is often just another
kind of cover. The best pilots never really stop flying. They just find new skies to patrol." As Ghost walked toward the hangar exit, Jessica caught sight of something that made her heart skip. Pinned to the instructor's jacket, so small, was almost invisible, was a tiny silver pin in the shape of wings. But these weren't ordinary military wings. They were the unofficial symbol of pilots who flew missions that officially never happened. Jessica had seen that pin only once before, in a classified briefing about Operation Whisper. That evening, Jessica called her mentor from flight school, a veteran pilot who had connections throughout the Air Force. "Colonel Martinez, it's Jessica Chen. I have a question about my new assignment."
"What is it, Chen?" "My instructor for the Ghost Operations program. They call her Ghost. Is there any chance she's actually—" Chen," Martinez interrupted, his voice suddenly serious. "Some questions are better left unasked. Some pilots are—"
"Better left unnamed. If you're learning from Ghost, consider yourself privileged and leave it at that." The line went dead, leaving Jessica staring at her phone. But she was smiling. Whatever the truth about her instructor's identity, Jessica knew she was learning from someone extraordinary. Someone who had proven that the most dangerous pilots weren't always the ones who made the most noise. As she prepared for her first operational assignment, Jessica thought about the woman in the photograph, the quiet pilot who had let herself be arrested and mocked because she knew that sometimes the best way to win was to let your enemies think they'd already won. In a world that celebrated flash and firepower, there was something deeply appealing about the idea of fighting battles that no one would ever know about, of protecting people who would never know your name. Jessica Chen was ready to become a ghost. And somewhere in suburban Virginia, a grandmother was teaching her granddaughter how to fly, passing on lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of those who serve without recognition. The sky was full of protectors, invisible and unnamed, watching over a world that slept peacefully because they never did. Rebecca Hayes reminds us that true strength often moves without noise. In a world that rushes to judge by appearance or title, she stood as proof that clarity, discipline, and quiet confidence can reshape everything. She was misjudged, mocked, and ignored, but she never bent, never explained, and never retaliated. Her power came from knowing who she was long before anyone else did. As you think about her journey, consider where in your own life you've been overlooked. Ask yourself what it means to stay true even when no one is watching. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names will never appear in history books, whose victories will never be celebrated, but whose courage ensures that others can sleep safely. If this story moved you, remember that there are real people like Rebecca Hayes serving in silence every day, protecting freedoms we take for granted, fighting battles we'll never hear about, and proving that heroism doesn't always come with fanfare.